Hey folks, welcome back to the Peaceful Way podcast, where we are exploring the mechanisms, concepts, and ideas behind peace and nonviolence and how we can make a more peaceful society and world. I have to apologize, I have not released any content in quite a few weeks, and I'm going to try in the next few weeks here to more regularly release some stuff for everyone, for the devoted few listeners that I have. I do appreciate you tuning in. Anyways, today I was just going to do a bit of a outtake ad-lib episode, just talking about one specific topic I've been thinking about, and that is moral panics and mass hysterias. I think this is particularly germane to the world that we live in today, to the cultural moment. And I think it's good to think through when we are experiencing a moral panic, particularly as it pertains to peace and nonviolence, because when society is whipped up into a fervor and the herd mentality and the mob violence, it is very difficult to escape that. And things can go south real fast. So just understanding when a moral panic is happening, what the sources are, and how to discern what is actually going on in society so that we can make better decisions for ourselves and hopefully be people who bring a calm to the situation and we don't make it worse than it needs to be. So the way I am defining a moral panic is like this: a feeling of fear or dread spread through a population because of a perceived existential threat, either to one's life or the social fabric, which is often exaggerated by false or unverified claims. It proliferates largely through conjecture, rumors, disinformation, and propaganda. Okay, I'll just read that definition one more time. It is a feeling of fear or dread spread throughout the population because of a perceived existential threat either to one's life or the social fabric, which is often exaggerated by false or unverified claims. It proliferates largely through conjecture, rumors, disinformation, and propaganda. Okay, so that is how I am defining moral panics. If anyone has a different definition, that's fine. But for the purposes of this discussion, that is how I am viewing a moral panic. And then the next one is mass hysterias. Okay, and mass hysterias have a lot of overlap with moral panics, but they aren't exactly the same thing. Mass hysteria is actually a more specific technical term, and there's actually a technical verbiage used in the word. So, and they are a more specific phenomenon. But the technical name for a mass hysteria is mass psychogenic illness or epidemic hysteria, wherein a large portion of a population will actually report to having symptoms of an illness or demon possession or something to that effect, despite no physical evidence of such a thing occurring. So the mass hysteria often will follow the moral panic that has ensued. So, I'll give a couple examples. This was commonplace. Mass psychogenic illness was very commonplace during the 2001 anthrax scare. I don't know if anyone remembers this, but there was basically one instance of some sort of powdery substance that was reported to be anthrax sent to someone in the White House, I believe. Anyways, that one instance turned into a moral panic where everyone thought they were getting anthrax sent to their homes, and everyone was super worried. And I do vaguely remember this when I was a teenager, the anthrax scare. But what actually happened was there was there was 2,400 reported anthrax-like symptoms despite never coming into contact with the substance. Okay, so the moral panic about anthrax happened. And I remember this, the media was just pushing this to the max. They were just, this was the story, this was the headline. It was for a good solid 2 to 4 weeks, I remember. That anthrax was just the big story in the news, and everyone needed to be super scared of it. Anyways, with that cultural milieu, people were reporting anthrax-like symptoms despite never coming into contact. So that's one story. That's one anecdote of psychogenic illness. There's also a historical record of this phenomenon during the Middle Ages where these things, they were dancing manias, would spontaneously break out all throughout Europe due to a belief people were demon possessed. So there would be these like large outbreaks of crowds that would just start, convulsing and dancing spontaneously and randomly. And it was like widespread throughout Europe, and they believed that they had like come into contact with someone who was demon possessed. So now they received this demon and they had to dance it out or something to that effect. I'm not sure exactly how that played out, but it was something to that effect. And so it's just kind of funny. And I think it's also very mimetic. People just saw this was happening and enough people were doing it that it became like a snowball effect where the momentum just carried through the social fabric, and more people started doing it with this sort of like social mob belief in that. Okay, so those are moral panics and mass hysterias. The worst types of violence often tends to be committed by crowds or mobs of people. It's very rarely just one single person. Though there are obviously in history, there are instances of single people murdering a lot of people. The vast majority of deaths by other humans happen by more so by entire groups of people, collectives of people, organizations, crowds, mobs. They can either be literal mobs, or it can be popular support, which then pushes insane government policies based on public opinion rather than actual data. And this makes moral panics very volatile and dangerous, right? Because when a crowd gets whipped up into a fervor, they are intensely irrational and are almost incapable of seeing reason. And they become highly, I hate to say it this way, but highly conspiratorial and sort of see the evil behind every bush and everybody is suspect. And so, and then this sort of rises through politics, and then politicians will then sort of propagate these moral panics through legislation, which I think is particularly dangerous. But a very good example of this would be like the Rwandan genocide with the Hutu and the Tutsis and the massacre that happened there. Often another characteristic of moral panics is that you are guilty until proven innocent. Okay. And a very good example of this would be in the 1980s during the Satanic Panic. If anyone remembers this, there was a rash of accusations that satanic cults were ritually and sexually abusing children. And it long story short, it became a case where anyone the children accused was guilty. And they found out later that many of the accused had never been even in contact with many of these children, that the sort of false accusations that were made were actually coerced out of the children. And so, there's there's this real strong strain of guilty until proven innocence. You have to prove your innocence. Um, and if you don't, then you are considered to be guilty, right? From a Girardian perspective, crowds tend to be in search of innocent scapegoats. And that scapegoat is the one who will bring peace to the community through through sacrifice of that scapegoat. So finding the one single person or the small group of people who are accused of bringing the plague to the town or bringing the famine to the village. You find the one off person, the one outsider, the outcast, and you sacrifice them, and everyone unanimously joins in the act of the sacrifice in killing the innocent scapegoat victim in order to bring cohesion and peace. And there's a catharsis that happens right through this scapegoat mechanism and sacrificing someone. And we see it all the time. That may seem like, well, that's just primitive, irrational dolts. But really, it happens all the time. Oftentimes, I think politics is a good example where parties will often expel one person or find one single individual in their party. Say if the party is starting to do poorly in the polls, they'll find the one person who can be the scapegoat. The person doesn't necessarily have to be totally innocent by all means or by any means, but they will be the scapegoat that is sacrificed in order to try and save the reputation of said political party. So this is kind of how it works. This is like the social mechanism as sort of Girard observed, and that this is how you can, in a very perverse way, bring strength to a cause or a community. And another characteristic of moral panics is they don't necessarily have to be based on fictitious events. They could stem from a real danger. But the problem is with a moral panic, the cure becomes worse than the disease, right? So they can often be incited by a single real incident, but metamorphosized into something else entirely. Okay, so it's not to say that every single moral panic in history didn't ever have some kind of basis in some fact or some concern. And I would think of something like the Iraq War, right? There was legitimate concerns that, Saddam Hussein at some point during his reign over Iraq had some kind of weapons development program or where he was trying to develop weapons of mass destruction. But, that's... Maybe he did do that. Maybe he did. He probably did at some point, but it didn't really go very far from what we can tell. And if he did have them, he didn't have them at the time of the invasion of Iraq. At least there's no evidence that's been uncovered that he, A, had weapons of mass destruction, or B, the capability to use those weapons in any real sense. So, yeah, that would be sort of like, that would be kind of an example of how a moral panic could be rooted in a legitimate fear, but the cure becomes worse than the actual disease. So I just want to do a quick list of moral panics and kind of go through them briefly. This is by no means an exhaustive list, and I also would like to say that there's almost never a time where humans aren't in some sort of moral panic, and that is because we have a negativity bias, and this negativity bias is a very good thing because it helps us survive, especially for more primitive humans. It helped us survive the elements and our environment, which was very hostile and dangerous to us. you have to be able to anticipate everything that can and will go wrong in order to survive. And so you kind of have to always be on the lookout for the worst case scenario. And so that has been sort of ingrained in our evolution, is this negativity bias. But the negativity bias can become very dangerous in a society like ours, which is so incredibly prosperous and safe, unlike the likes of which we've ever seen before. So our intense negativity bias, seeing the worst possible outcomes of any specific issue, you name it, right? It is kind of lends us to fall into moral panics. Okay, so I'll just go through a list of moral panics. First one is overpopulation. Okay, this was there's a author named I believe Paul Ehrlich. He wrote a book called The Population Bomb, and he sort of predicted that this was in the 50s and 60s, I believe, and he predicted that humanity was going to run out of food, and we were on the cusp of mass famine and starvation. And this actually became like very in vogue within sort of the scientific community and academia for quite a long time. And it was just completely false. And there's still many people today, though I don't think it has as much cachet anymore, but there's still many people today who really buy into this sort of like overpopulation myth that like we're on the cusp of a cataclysmic event because of overpopulation. And that like this even lends into the environmentalist alarmism. This idea that there's too many humans on Earth and we're making it inhabitable for any life. But anyways, the Paul Ehrlich overpopulation ended up being completely debunked because it just did not account for the kinds of innovation that was going to happen in agriculture, and GMOs in specific actually helped us to grow way more food than we could have ever possibly imagined, with much higher yields in our crops. You got to remember, this was when there was like 3 billion people on Earth, and now there's more than double that. We now have more food per capita than we've ever had in human history. Food is more plentiful and readily available in just pretty much every Western society, as well as many like poorer third world countries. The biggest problem is not malnutrition. It is obesity and heart disease and cardiovascular diseases and things like that, which it's that we have too much food, not that we don't have too little. All right. Lynchings in the US in 100, 200 years ago, before the abolishment of slavery, but sometimes, no, even after. I believe there's lynchings up till the 40s or 50s, but there was often, if a black person looked at a white woman wrong or something, it was considered to be attempted rape or something like that. So these sort of like crowd mob violence. There was false accusations of a rape. The famous case of Emmett Till, where it was a 14-year-old boy who was falsely accused of raping a white woman, and he was lynched for this. And everyone just sort of like bought into it, and that was just the cultural milieu they grew up in. And they had no mechanism for recognizing that they were in the midst of a moral panic, that like black people are specifically more prone to rape white women, and that would lead to many lynchings. And obviously that's a very dangerous mentality to have. The Salem witch trials, that's another example of moral panics, and also example of, guilty until proven innocent. So one of the famous ways they would execute witches is tie a heavy stone around their necks, and if they sunk, that means they weren't a witch, but then they drown. But if they rose, if they floated rather, that means they were a witch, and then they'd be executed anyway, which that never actually happened. But it's a catch-22 kind of situation. Another one is like video games inspiring mass shootings. This was a very big thing, especially after Columbine, because the Columbine kids purported to be big fans of, can't remember what game it was. Maybe it was Doom. It was one of those early first-person shooter games, and there was all this panic around. Video games must have inspired this mass shooting, and Grand Theft Auto has also been at the center of this controversy in later years as well. That this promotes hooliganism, and the reason there's a mass shooting is because of a video game. When it's just there may be some correlation, but there's no causal link to video games and extremely violent acts. A more feasible explanation of mass shootings or mass killings of any kind is some kind of trauma, abuse, or neglect. It could even just be straight up psychopathy, something like that. It could be some kind of pathological illness that somebody has. But the idea that video games inspire mass shootings, there's really no evidence for it. As I mentioned previously, the other one was the Satanic Panic. I highly recommend people check out the podcast. It's actually a CBC podcast, and it's excellent. It's just called The Satanic Panic by the CBC. Look it up. It's just like a 7 or 8 part series, and it focused on the Satanic Panic in the town of Martinsville, Saskatchewan. And there you can really get the idea of you can really see how bad the Satanic Panic was in the 80s and 90s, and just how it ruined so many people's lives. So many people had their children taken away from them. People were driven to suicide. They lost their careers or reputation because of false accusations. And anyways, that's a good one to check out. Another one is, and maybe this is a more controversial one, but climate alarmism. The idea that we are facing catastrophic climate change, extinction level climate change because of man-made global warming. This is hyperbolic to say the least, and there is, it's funny because this is a topic that just can never be talked about with any level of nuance. It just has to be one thing or the other. And like for me, this is an example of where something can stem from a legitimate issue. And to me, it seems that anthropomorphic global warming, meaning human-caused global warming, is a real phenomenon, that we are slightly warming the earth due to greenhouse gas emissions. That seems to be the case to me. However, the effects of that are largely unknown. Many of the models and predictions have just proven to be completely false. But even the IPCC, which is the International Panel on Climate Change, and they kind of release a lot of the data around this. Even their story isn't as hysterical as what you'll read in the news or hear from, sort of characters like Al Gore or Greta Thunberg, that, we're on the cusp of a extinction level event. It's just simply not the case. There is some warming, which will cause some problems. It also has some good benefits. But the idea that we are sort of on the cusp of this just complete collapse of carbon-based life forms is just it's completely absurd, and it's not scientific. And all that to say, like, there are certainly problems and ways we can address it, and if we can find ways of reliable and affordable energy that doesn't emit carbon or emits less carbon, I'm all for it. I'm all about that, right? I'm not all about it at the cost of affordable, reliable energy that saves billions of lives every year, particularly in poorer nations, which really heavily rely on fossil fuels in order to escape their death-giving poverty. So yeah, climate alarmism is another example of moral panic. Race hysteria, there's another one, and I've talked about this in a previous episode, All Justice, No Peace. You can go back and look at that one. But sort of generally the idea that we are is so irredeemably, that many countries in the West are irredeemably racist. Racism is embedded in the system, and there's no way you can't be racist. That we are particularly more racist than we've ever been, which is just, if you were to measure racism, which is, it can be difficult to measure, but if you're going to measure racism, by all measurements, it is on a steep decline. There are very few aspects of racism that are increasing. The only one that I can find where like hate crimes are increasing and slurs on the internet are increasing is actually anti-Semitic racism and anti-Jewish racism. That every other form of racism is on the decline by any measurement that we have. We in the West, in Canada in particular, America, are some of the least racist countries, and I know that's almost blasphemy to say these days, but they are. We know this by the numbers. The data is in. Okay, America, the USA, for example, is the number one destination for a majority of African countries. Immigrants from African countries. It's the number one destination for immigrants from Latin American countries and Asian countries. All these like non-white countries, one of their top destinations is to go to the U.S., which apparently is one of the most racist societies on the planet Earth. But you wouldn't know it if you were just looking at that data, right? So there's this just complete hysteria around racism, and anytime a racist incident occurs, it is sort of trumpeted as this endemic, systemic thing that can't be rooted out unless our society is torn down to its bare bones and rebuilt in these utopian critical race theorist image. And it's just completely not true. That's not reality, and you cannot build a society that way. And this isn't to say that, I think it's good for a society, for an enlightened, reasoned, scientific society, to have a certain amount of allergy, to have a certain allergic reaction to racism, to, sort of overt racism and even less overt racism. I think it is good. That is like healthy, but there's definitely overcorrections that we're seeing. There's definitely a bunch of what I would call grifters capitalizing on this hysteria and using it as a way to make money, to build particular industries, particularly around race, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is a whole industry in and of itself. It's a very capitalistic venture, despite claims to the opposite. It is very much a moneymaker. Okay, another example of a moral panic was rock and roll music. I don't know if anyone, this is probably before my time, but I do know just from reading and listening to podcasts, rock and roll music, there was tons of panic around it, that it was gonna make people do drugs and live this lascivious lifestyle. Excuse me. And it just wasn't true. It didn't, there's really no causal link to that. If anything, people had it in reverse. People were experimenting more, were, I would say, becoming more open to taboo experiences, and rock and roll music sort of came out of that. It wasn't the other way around. There's another one that I remember was in the 2000s. Eminem was like this, he was the rapper Eminem. He was a pretty big thing in the early 2000s, late 90s. There was the feminists and the Christians joined forces to try and ban Eminem's music because they believe that he inspired rape against women and that he had all these terrible lyrics. And I mean, to be fair, he had some pretty terrible, some pretty grisly lyrics, and he really liked to push the envelope in that. But that's the idea that like Eminem himself was going to sort of inspire this was just sort of absurd, and the panic around it just never really matched the reality. These days, Eminem is actually considered to be more vanilla, both in more ways than just one, no pun intended. But anyways, that was a particular moral panic that I remember. There's so many to list. That was just a few that I kind of wanted to name off quick and just talk about. So now the thing about moral panics, many sociologists have observed, is that there is what they call a morning after effect, which is sort of like the hangover from the panic after the dust has settled and it's kind of passed. Everyone kind of looks back at it and almost laughs at it in many cases, or cries in some cases for sure, where it's like, how the hell did we fall into that? That was crazy, right? So this is the morning after effect. And it's funny because in the morning after effect, people note that everyone sort of looks back at it and says, how were people so crazy and how did they believe such insane things? All the while pretending they weren't the ones who got swept up in the moral panic, right? and so that's something to be aware of, is that after the moral panic, many people will kind of scoff and laugh at the people who got swept up in that, not even realizing they too themselves got swept up into it, right? So yeah, moral panics and mass hysterias. And I think I said it at the top, and I'm going to say it again. This is particularly germane to our moment in history right now. And I'm going to say it. I was avoiding talking about it up till this moment, but the COVID-19 global pandemic has brought us no end of moral panics around it, from every single anecdote that you've heard about a young person having a severe outcome or death, a young and healthy person having a severe outcome or death from COVID. And that's true. There is the odd person who does that, despite the fact that the data, the actual facts show us that is very, very rare. And your one anecdote doesn't prove the exception does not prove the rule, right? So or disprove the rule rather. I think we are in probably one of the greatest moral panics of our century for sure. There's still a lot of the century left, but it certainly has been exacerbated by particular political actors, particular corporate actors, and particular media actors. And I think when the dust settles, it may take years, it may even take decades. We're going to look back at this and see things like massive draconian lockdowns were just one of the largest public policy failures that we've ever seen, and they hardly saved any lives, and that is mostly depending on where you're looking. I understand there are exceptions to that rule where in some cases lockdowns did save deaths from COVID, though it's hard to say how many deaths overall they saved, if any, but they certainly stopped some COVID deaths. There are some exceptions to that, so I don't want anyone arguing with me on that point. I can acknowledge that. However, I think on the whole, we're going to realize what a failure of public policy it was. The terrible, unforeseen consequences of lockdowns will affect us for probably decades to come. the massive transfer of wealth from the middle class and the poor of our society has been transferred through government fiat, through government force, to the billionaires, the multinational corporations. And I'm not even just this is like literally true. You look at the Saudi princes or the Elon Musk or the Jeff Bezos of the world. These people have became incredibly wealthy in the year 2020, and they their wealth increased. There was more billionaires created in 2020 than any year previous to that. Well, the GDP of most countries had a retraction. The GDP, say in my province in Alberta, Canada, had more than an 8% retraction, which is the worst since the 1930s in the Great Depression. So that what that shows me is that there are the top tier of our society really benefited from this, while the bottom half of our society is really struggling from this. So. I think it is such a travesty, and it is just completely wrapped in mimetic hysteria. People just surrendering any semblance of rational thought, critical thinking, and reasoning about the pandemic, what they're trying to understand for themselves, what a real cost-benefit analysis is for your own health, how to assess risk. People have completely outsourced that to certain bureaucrats and elites who, I will say this as well, that a sort of appointed government bureaucrat who was formerly a doctor is not a practicing scientist or doctor. They are government bureaucrats, and they're the ones who have been touted as the official, I guess, or the correct point of view when it comes to lockdowns and whether or not they're efficacious. But anyways, I think it is completely horrible. It is a total moral panic. It is a mass hysteria through and through. It is creating a completely hypochondriac society, and it is creating a very distrustful society, which is actually the more alarming part of it. And that's going to be a whole nother episode I'm going to make, is how more trusting societies are less violent societies. So anyways, thanks for listening. Make sure to follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Just search The Peaceful Way Podcast on any of those platforms. You can also go to my website, thepeacefulway.ca. All my episodes and links and stuff like that are there. Make sure you subscribe. I'm also on YouTube. And give me a 5-star rating and review. That really helps. If you ever felt like you wanted to support the show, either through cryptocurrency or Patreon, go to patreon.com/thepeacefulway. And then I have my crypto addresses in the description of the episode. All right. Peace.